And we're recording session number 6 of Introduction to Worldviews and Apologetics. I'm Dr. John McMath. I'm joined by my friends in Italy and in the Philippines as we study together. Today, we're going to be looking at the worldview that we call Deism. If you have your notes there, I'm going to walk through this today. Deism is an interesting thing. It's an example of a worldview that, for the most part, has been discredited by good Christian apologetics. Really, honest to goodness, deism is not a major thing in the world today because Christians have made good criticisms and accurate critiques that have just made deism an unattractive option. Deism has had a lot of effects on the modern world, mostly in the West. Europe and the United States, Canada, have had a lot of impact of deism, but we find it in every part of the world, every place where modernist theologians have been able to train students to be pastors. There is an effect of deism. So we'll be looking at that today, and mostly at some American characters who are interesting, because of the effects they've had on the world. Let's see what I can do here. All right, it's okay. There it is. Deism is the belief that there is a God who made the world, but who never interrupts it with supernatural events such as miracles or scripture or salvation. So this diagram shows the world, which God created, but God is no longer in the world. He's walked away. And so you've got the Deus absconditus, the God who ran away. He went to all the trouble of creating the world, the universe, and making all the laws to make it run. And then he just walks away. He's off doing other things. Perhaps he's taking a walk. We don't know. And deism is a system that flourished during the European Enlightenment. In the years after the Reformation of the 16th century on into the 18th century, philosophers began looking for the possibility of doing philosophy without God. And most were not atheists. They still saw the philosophical necessity of some kind of God, but they felt free to go off in interesting new directions. Deism was one of the things that popped up. An all-powerful God who created the universe, but then never gets involved ever again. He never interrupts the world. Evolution just follows its rules, and the laws of physics just do their thing. There are moral laws, but it really doesn't matter very much to God. The laws are there and there'll be results, but God doesn't enforce that. He doesn't communicate anything more about it. So it's an interesting system because the deists actually believe in an infinite, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God. They've got all of the components of theism, except for the supernatural interruption of history. So God doesn't do miracles. He doesn't produce scripture. And he certainly doesn't reach down and arrange for salvation. God is beyond the universe, but not in it. So deism flourished during the Enlightenment up through the 18th century, the late 1700s. It was starting to be a used up thing. During the 1800s, it died out because Christians had good answers to the questions that were raised by deism. Deism has left a number of bad effects. For instance, the denial of miracles. There are still people out there who have heard someplace, probably in some university setting, that miracles are impossible by definition. A miracle is a violation of natural law, but we all know that natural laws can never be violated because God made natural laws and we can't ever violate. Okay, now that's actually bad logic, but there's an awful lot of people who have heard that someplace and believe it. The critical views of the Bible, the idea that the authors claimed by the Bible actually didn't write the Bible. So Moses didn't have anything to do with the Pentateuch, and David didn't write the Psalms, and Isaiah didn't write Isaiah, and John didn't write John. Paul didn't write his epistles until 300 years later. All these other stupid theories that try to undermine the historical and obviously spiritual significance of the Bible rose during the development of deism, and they haven't gone away. And then there's a general attitude of society in general, particularly in the West and in all those countries that have been affected by Western philosophy. Western philosophy in general is a good thing. It's been a helpful thing. But the attitude that we can safely behave as though there is no God is a very dangerous thing. Elsewhere, I've referred to this attitude as foolishness, practical atheism. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And what he means by that is, if there is a God, he doesn't matter to me. I don't have to deal with God. So I'm just going to live my life any way I feel like it. The Bible calls that foolishness. The naturalistic spirit of deism, by naturalistic, I mean relying on the material world only, lives on in the modern world in various forms of other things. There's a thing called finite godism, the belief in a small God, a God who is little and not very influential, is very common today. That's something that we find. The people who hold to finite godism usually don't know that that's what they're holding to, but they believe in a very little God who may step in and take care of answering a prayer if you ever have an emergency. But besides that, he's not big enough to handle any of the real problems in life. Deists held to an infinite God, which is one of the problems for them. If God is infinite, why can't he communicate? Why can't he do miracles? But we'll get to that. So deism is a belief in a God who made the world but never interrupts it. Some deists hold that God doesn't care at all what happens to the world. That's actually a fairly rare kind. We find that in the French deists of the 16th and 17th centuries. Very little of that survived. A second type holds that God does in fact care about things like the laws of physics and other natural principles, mathematics and whatnot. And so he enforces those things. If somebody tries to live as though 2 + 2 = 5, God would see to it that the karma gets him right away, or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how they think God will enforce the laws of physics, but that's a second type. And this was mostly the English deists, and most of that has just died out altogether. A third type holds that God also cares about moral laws and prefers that man be obedient to these things, okay, but does nothing more about it. This again was held mostly in Europe, and is a viewpoint that has just disappeared. A fourth type, also common in England and in America during the Revolutionary War years, so the latter parts of the 18th century. This fourth type holds that God created the universe, is infinitely powerful, and he actually cares about not only physical laws, but also about moral laws, and that there is a life after death with rewards for good behavior and punishment for bad behavior. So this fourth type of deism is actually really, really close to Christianity. What it lacks is the belief in a Trinity, and particularly in Christ Himself. So that's what we're going to look at today. I want to look at some American examples because, well, frankly, they're the most accessible. They're easy to find, and I don't have to speak French to get at them. Also, they're the most responsible for the long-lasting effects of deism. Now, interestingly, two of the characters I'm going to introduce, Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, were really important during the American Revolution. And their writing and their public speaking to some extent, and their involvement in the writing of say, the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution have had an enormous effect on everything in United States history. They're very, very important for that. And because of that, they laid the foundation for a truly remarkable American experiment, which may yet prove not to work very well. But the principles have demonstrated their truth. So people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and quite a few others, it's been argued that Benjamin Franklin was probably deist. Most of these men were active in the Anglican Church or in a Methodist version of the Anglican Church. Most of them were elders or presbyters in their local churches because that's what people did. That's what particularly wealthy landowners in the British colonies were expected to do, and so they did that. But their primary interest was mostly politics, but built on a philosophic and theological foundation. So interesting stuff. The fellows we're going to look at today built their thinking on Greek philosophy, primarily Plato and Aristotle, but Epicurus pops up more times than I like to admit, and on the thinkers of the Enlightenment. A lot of Kant, a lot of Hegel, a lot of John Locke. John Locke was a British empirical thinker who said an awful lot of really good stuff, but he also laid a lot of the foundations of deism. It's important that the Americans were mostly politicians. Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson were politicians. They were very concerned about developing a new equitable form of government for the United States. Their theology forms the foundation for their political views. And mostly their political views are very sound. And we'll look at that as we get farther in. Let's start off with Thomas Paine. This is a portrait of him at the time. Died in 1809. Paine was among the most militant of the American deists. He wrote widely on all kinds of stuff. His books, Common Sense and The Rights of Man, are very, very important works for the period. If we want to understand the thinking of the founders of the American experience, we have to read Common Sense, we have to read The Rights of Man. The idea that men have rights that are God-given, not government-granted, is something that is a deistic idea. It's also a theistic idea. Christians were teaching the same thing. So a Christian like Benjamin Franklin, who had some deistic traits as well, but Benjamin Franklin was what we would often call a warm deist. He actually believed in a relationship with God and all kinds of stuff. The founders believed that God was the source of human rights. So when Thomas Paine was writing The Rights of Man, he didn't say, we demand these rights because we're more powerful than the English. He said, these rights derive from the Creator. There is no other source. And because of that, the government has no leg to stand on, has no right to deny freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of self-defense. These are all human rights that are a part of the creation set. And at this point, the deists like Paine are using exactly the same arguments that Christians would use from the Bible. At any rate, Paine believed that the principles of the Republic and the ideal of equality were threatened by the established churches. When we say established churches, again, we've got to understand a little bit of European history. Particularly after the Reformation, the European states tended to pick a religion, pick a Christian religion, whether Roman Catholicism or some Protestant group. So, for example, the Germans were Lutheran, the English were Anglican. The Dutch held to a Reformed faith. They call it Dutch Reformed. The Scots were Presbyterians, and so on. And that was a state church. The establishment of a church means that the state funds and controls a church that is the church of the whole state. And so everyone who is born in that state is a member of the state church by definition. And Thomas Paine saw the abuses that would happen with that. Those of us who are evangelical, and LJPF is definitely an evangelical group, believe that the church should be separate from the state. We believe that that the state has an important part of life, and the church also has an important part of life. Thomas Paine didn't seem to understand that there was a possibility for independent churches. So he argued that the church is just a bad thing. He wrote a major work, The Age of Reason, that says in this age of scientific reasoning, there is no argument at all for claims of supernatural revelation, that is, the Bible. And by writing this, he was attempting to discredit the clergy. Clergymen at the time of the American Revolution were mostly Anglican or Catholic, and they were, for the most part, beholden to the throne of England. They were subjects of the crown, and therefore not likely to support the revolution. Everything got so political. At any rate, Thomas Paine said, let's just destroy the Bible altogether. And he gave it a good try. It didn't work, but he gave it a good try. Paine believed in God and no more. That is, he believed in an infinite, all-powerful God who didn't have any interest in interacting with the world that he had created. It's simple as that. The key point for Paine was revelation. This is what it really all comes down to. Paine could believe in all of the theistic points, most of Christianity, except for revelation. He believed that God simply could not actively communicate with man because human language wasn't adequate to the task. We can know nothing about God, Paine says, except by the exercise of human reason. So a written revelation, any claims to a written revelation were simply set up to enslave mankind and to monopolize power and profit. In other words, Thomas Paine had a very low opinion of the established church. He had a particular contempt for Christianity. This can be understood as a symptom of his times, but it was still, it was a visceral, emotional contempt. When the corrupt European church maintained the status quo of the clergy and the nobility, okay, there's the spirit of the age. In Europe, at the time of the American Revolution, and at the time of the French Revolution, which would happen shortly thereafter, the population was divided up between the elite, powerful, and the vast majority of very poor people. And so you've got a lower class, that's 99% of the population, and a 1% who have all the power and all the money. And at the time of these revolutions, the powerful were either the nobility who had their offices by birth, or they were part of the clergy. They were bishops and archbishops and elders and whatnot, and had power because of their relationship to the church. That power in the 17th and 18th centuries was tied up in land. And in Europe, this was a major problem. The nobility, of course, kings and dukes and earls and whatnot, owned land. They were the major landowners, and everyone who lived on that land was a subject of that particular duke or earl or whoever. And the earl could build a castle and put together an army. And all of the serfs, the peasants who lived on the land, would pay rent to the earl and would provide fodder for his army when he wanted to go to war. The clergy by which I mean the bishops and the monastic powers, primarily the abbots, owned an enormous percentage of the land in Europe. Between the nobility and the clergy, the church, most of the land in Europe was under the control of the elite. The revolutions that we see in America and in France were at least partially social revolutions. They were trying to re-evaluate the relationship of property to all of the people. So in the American Revolution, it was very important that private property be held by those who earned it. So there were to be no inherited rights to property by dukes and earls and kings and whatnot. And the church in particular could not own vast tracts of land to make a profit. There are a lot of specific controls. The French Revolution was much more violent, much more violent. The guillotine was invented in France in order to kill the elite, both amongst the clergy and amongst the nobility. The French Revolution was an ugly thing. The American Revolution was ugly, but not nearly to that extent. And the ongoing results have been quite different as well. Okay, so that's what Paine believed about God. And we can understand some of what he was trying to do. So what about creation? Thomas Paine believed that God created everything there is out of nothing. So he believed in a kind of ex nihilo creation. He also believed that God sustained the whole world in existence, which is actually a very important issue. Creation out of nothing takes only a moment. The sustaining of the world in existence is an ongoing thing that lasts throughout all of history. Deism then can be thought of, just in general, as a focus on general revelation, while at the same time denying special revelation. General revelation is the created universe and what we can learn about it by studying science and by studying mathematics and by studying, I don't know, sociology and psychology. A lot of truth that we can learn by going out and studying why water runs downhill or why goats live in herds or whatnot. Okay. The word of God for Thomas Paine is the creation we behold. Okay, these are his words. And it is in this word, which no human invention can counterfeit or alter, that God speaketh universally to man. So that's his whole thing. Paine believed that the things that constitute the universe could not have made themselves. There must be a first cause. Okay, and that goes all the way back to Plato. Philosophers from the beginning of Western philosophy have understood that if something exists when there could reasonably be nothing at all, then there has to be a cause. And for all the caused things we see, there ultimately has to be a first cause. Okay, ultimately, the things that we see in the universe couldn't have made themselves. So there has to be a first cause. This first cause is eternal. It's of a nature totally different to any material existence that we know of, and by the power of which all things exist. And this first cause, man rightly calls God. So Thomas Paine is actually entirely correct at that point. We call this the teleological argument, that there appears to be a design in this universe. There is a first cause to the universe, which is the cosmological argument. The argument from design says that the work of a man's hands is proof of the existence of the man. And since a watch is positive evidence of the existence of a watchmaker, then in like manner, the creation is evidence to our reason and senses of the existence of a creator. A fellow by the name of William Paley, somewhere along the line, I've got a picture of William Paley. William Paley was a Christian apologist, and he uses this exact same argument. This is the teleological argument, the argument from design. If you're walking through the woods, here you are, woods and streams and the sunshine overhead, and you pick up a slightly grubby looking pocket watch that's obviously been laying there for a while, you don't assume that that pocket watch arose naturally on that piece of trail in the woods. You assume that somewhere or another there is a watchmaker who explains the presence of the existence of that watch. Okay, maybe that watchmaker walked away from it, but there is a watchmaker. And we have evidence to believe our reason and our senses to suggest the existence of a creator. There's nothing irrational about believing that there is a creator. Oh, man. Thomas Paine had a high view of man. He held that man is a rational, personal, free being, very different from pantheism. He believed that all men were created equal. That's a rallying cry that we're going to see all through both the American and the French Revolutionary periods. All men are created equal, that every human being's religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. Okay, as far as that goes, that's not bad. And this, in fact, is what some have called the Western foundational cultural religion. It's a kind of a political religion that even non-religious people can more or less agree to. That's beginning to break up because if you don't believe that the Bible is revelation from God, that is very difficult to speak seriously about religious duties. Nevertheless, Paine argued we ought to do the right thing. We ought to love mercy. We ought to endeavor to make our fellow creatures happy. And I suspect that although Paine denied the influence of Scripture, he grew up in a Christian home and probably had read the prophets. What does the Lord require of you, man, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Thomas Paine tried not to be a Christian, but there was a lot going on there. Paine, however, adamantly denied that man is in rebellion against God and in need of a salvation. There is no such thing as redemption. That's an important point among deists. In general, the deists did not believe that there was any need for a miraculous salvation or redemption. Okay. However, Paine did agree that evil exists. He didn't try to reconcile the presence of evil with his concept of God, which was a mistake. If God is good, he wouldn't like evil. If God was powerful, he would be able to do something about it. The atheist says, Therefore, there is no God, not even a deistic sort of God. And Thomas Paine was arguing that God exists, he is all powerful and all good. And therefore, his sort of God is vulnerable to this atheist argument. And in fact, this is part of the reason that deism died. The only evil that Thomas Paine seemed to acknowledge was a social injustice or the corruption of revealed religion. He says social problems can be solved by politics. If there are too many poor people and not enough rich people, we can redistribute the wealth, or we can take from the rich to give to the poor, or something. We can do politics. Religion is its own kind of problem. Thomas Paine hated religion. He said religion is a problem that can only be solved by preventing the introduction of any revelation beyond the creation itself. So if we can just outlaw the Bible, then everything will be fine, and life will be totally wonderful. Thomas Paine had an ethical system of sorts, and he summarized the heart of his beliefs here. The moral duty of man consists in imitating the moral goodness and beneficence of God as manifested in the creation toward all of his creatures. So if you look at, I don't know what, the fact that hamsters build nests, or that mountain goats were built with feet to climb mountains, we should treat one another that way. I'm not sure quite what he means by this. It's his ethics don't have a lot of foundation, but they do. Okay, when it comes to history, the past, the deists as a whole didn't really have a lot to say about history. They thought studying history was important so we could learn from the mistakes of others, but they certainly didn't believe that the God who created this universe was active in history, or heading toward any kind of a goal in history. So Thomas Paine really didn't set forth a view of history, but he claimed that the Bible was historically unreliable. That was really important to him. He ridiculed the biblical accounts of creation, the fall of Satan, the virgin birth, the resurrection, and very much more. He argued that the traditional authorship of the Bible was all wrong, every last bit of it, and that the New Testament was not written, which is really a fun argument, until 300 years after the supposed events. Just for the fun of it, I put a little scrap of a collection that we find in England these days at the Bodmer Library. This is called the Bodmer Papyrus, or is one scrap of the Bodmer Papyrus. There's some 250 scraps of papyrus found in Egypt. They date to the latter part of the 2nd century, so around 170 AD, and they claim to be copies of the New Testament. They may have been copies of the original, but they're found in Egypt. I suspect they're 2 generations removed. So if we have the Bodmer Papyrus that by 175 was making copies of the New Testament and accounts for most of the New Testament, how is it that the New Testament wasn't written until 125 years after the Bodmer Papyrus was copied? Okay, what we have here is actually 19th century archaeology. The archaeologists who found the Bodmer Papyrus, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well, have demonstrated with hard facts, evidence, that the critical notion that the New Testament wasn't written until 3 centuries after the time of Christ is simple nonsense. Now, we know from reading the Bible that it's not true, but here is hard evidence. When things like this began being published, deism, frankly, didn't have a chance. You can't hold a position like this because it's just wrong, and everybody knows it. So Thomas Paine did not believe that supernatural acts of God had ever occurred in all of history. Nothing supernatural has ever happened in all of history. He argued that the laws of nature, as observed, are inviolable. Therefore, an event that violates those laws, which is a miracle, are impossible by definition. Now, back when we were studying the notion of theism, we answered that particular argument. The fact is, the laws of nature are a small subset of all of the laws that God obeys. And God can violate what we think is a law of nature without violating any of his own principles. He's operating on a bigger stage. So as Christians, we have never had a problem with this particular argument. And again, a reason that deism died. Okay, man's destiny. Paine did express a hope in life after death, as most of the deists did, or especially the American and English fourth style. He believed that morally good people would be happy and morally wicked would be punished. Those who were neither particularly good nor particularly bad would just be dropped entirely. Paine really didn't describe what he meant by that, but that didn't seem to bother anybody at the time. Thomas Jefferson is significantly more famous than Thomas Paine. He's the third president of the United States. He's the author of the Declaration of Independence, had a huge part in the American Constitution. He's considered the major writer of the American Revolution and of the early development of the United States. Jefferson argued hard for religious freedom and for the abolition of slavery. Thomas Jefferson was different from Paine in that he didn't want to see religion disappear. Thomas Paine argued that religion would be better off if all the priests were taken out and shot. But Jefferson said, if my neighbor believes in a God who is a three-headed sloth that neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So as a politician, as a leader, I don't care about the religious views of others. We ought to be morally bound by our own conscience in religious matters. He's a good guy on that level. Jefferson also argued hard for the abolition of slavery. He felt that it was, if all men are created equal, then obviously slavery is wrong. Obviously. Now, prior to the American Revolution, slavery was a worldwide phenomenon. It was practiced in every culture. Every race has experienced slavery. It was always a bad thing. The Bible never defends slavery, but recognizes its presence. And Thomas Jefferson, as a deist, still considered the natural rights of man to trump the tradition of slavery, even though Jefferson himself owned slaves. As a landowner in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, whole families of slaves who had grown up on his plantation. And when he inherited the plantation from his father, he inherited the slaves that were on the land. His slaves had no education, very poor English skills. They could not have gotten along by themselves. And Jefferson could not, by himself, give away or emancipate all of his slaves. They would not have been able to survive on their own in the culture of the time. And he would have been bankrupt, since his plantation could not be operated without slaves at that time in history. So he was in a tough place. He believed that what had been done in the past was wrong and needed to be changed. Yeah. His philosophical and religious views, this deism, form a foundation of his writings. But he rarely makes them explicit. Most of the deism we find in Jefferson is in his letters to friends. So we're going to see a lot of stuff. Jefferson believed in one God, the creator, as God is infinitely wise, good, righteous, and powerful. This quote, I hold that when we take a view of the universe, its parts, general and particular, it is impossible for the human mind not to perceive and feel a conviction of design, consummate skill, and indefinite power in every atom of its composition. Jefferson was influenced by Isaac Newton, who believed the world was in harmony under the rule of natural law, and thus open to scientific investigation. The world is open to study because God created it that way. This is a common deistic theme, and it's correct. This is the view that natural law is instituted by God during the creation, is a reflection of the eternal character of God himself, and is thus stable. We can do scientific investigation without worrying that our results will change every time we do an experiment. So if you're studying gravity and you drop a cannonball, it will fall at the same rate every time you drop it. Not because of something innate about cannonballs, but because this is natural law. Gravity works the way it works because that's the way God is. God is stable, and natural law doesn't change. This goes on. Okay. What did he think about man? Well, Jefferson taught the equality of mankind. He held that truths are grounded in nature itself and are unchangeable. They are natural rights and therefore universal. Other rights Jefferson took to be natural are the right of association, the right of self-government, the right to freedom of religion. Logically, obviously, if men are equal, slavery is wrong. And Jefferson fought that. It would be another 90 years after the penning of the Declaration of Independence, and at the end of a terrible civil war, the most costly war ever fought by Americans. Terrible. Hundreds of thousands of men died, hundreds of thousands of people in general. A terrible war. Slavery was finally abolished in the United States. The Declaration of Independence has this memorable phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, that's clear. And that is clearly true from a biblical point of view. We also believe in a creator, that natural law produces unalienable rights, a right to life, a right to liberty, a right to the pursuit of happiness. Locke, the philosopher who went before Jefferson in England, would say that all men have the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of personal property. And Jefferson didn't want to say it quite that way, but he means the same thing. These are foundational particularly to the American notion of human rights, which are God-given and not bestowed by a government. And therefore, no government can take them away. They are unalienable. And that's the foundation of all of the rest that he would do. Government and religion. Jefferson taught that government exists to protect the natural law and the rights of free people. He opposed anarchy, which at one end of the continuum is the lack of government altogether. And he opposed tyranny, which is the totalitarian end of the spectrum, the use of armed force to demand obedience to the government. When the government has to walk into civil society and say, you must do what we tell you to, or we will shoot you, that government is illegitimate. There's something wrong with that. Jefferson's notion of government was a limited government. He said that he believed government should stay out of religious issues. He thought religion was a good thing and ought generally to be encouraged, but that particular sects should not be established as government-favored churches. In this, he was reading the history of Europe. He's absolutely right. Now, that does not mean that government should be anti-religious or irreligious. It is a good thing for individuals who work for the government to also be involved in religion. But in general, the state cannot establish a church. The state should just stay out of it, but should encourage religion. All right. Jefferson, in general, was not as radical as Thomas Paine. However, he rejected the major teachings of Christianity. He believed that Jesus was a great teacher, but that his message was corrupted by the Apostle Paul. Jefferson actually went on to produce his own abridged version of the Bible, which is kind of fun. It turned out to be a pamphlet with some of the teachings of Jesus. Jefferson always considered himself a Christian. However, he admitted he was a Christian who rejected the deity of Christ. And what do you say? Here's a quotation from Jefferson. I don't know if they only made one portrait of Jefferson during his life, but this is what I come up with all the time. A wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government. So Thomas Jefferson was the apostle of limited government. And the American Constitution was written primarily to limit government. That's a biblical concept. It's a good concept and a right concept. That Jefferson rejected Christianity doesn't seem to matter very much. Government and religion. In general, Jefferson taught that government exists to protect natural law and the rights of people. He opposed anarchy, tyranny, so on. So, okay, evil. Jefferson taught that man has both good and evil qualities. The purpose of government is to prevent the evil qualities from causing harm. Thus, he supported a judicial system and the police power of government. He also taught that governments could become evil and tyrannical. and that when that happened, it was the duty of the governed to overthrow those governments and replace them with more suitable forms. This is what he taught leading up to the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence essentially says this: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one nation to separate from another, it behooves, common decency to make an explanation. Therefore, we produce this Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. Okay, that's what it was for. And Jefferson produced this quote: "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Sometimes you just have to rise up and replace what hasn't worked." Ethically, Jefferson believed in universal moral law. He said this is grounded in nature itself, but comes from the hand of the creator. So ethics, the difference between right and wrong, is founded in the character of God himself, as expressed in nature. So this notion of natural law was quite common in the Enlightenment, and it has been common among Christian thinkers since the time of Augustine. The idea is really simple. God created the world with physical laws like chemistry and mathematics and so on. And he also created it with moral laws. So murder is wrong, marriage is sacred, and so on. People of most cultures agree to the most fundamental of moral laws, even if they find ways to break them. People who murder millions in the name of politics know that what they're doing is technically wrong, but they think they've got a good excuse. Okay, Jefferson's view of history was to say very little. He did think that the study of history was a necessary safeguard. You can learn from the mistakes of the past. But Jefferson believed that God never broke into history to perform miracles. He was willing to admit that the operation of providence went on, that God superintends the events of history for the common good. So God is doing some overall good thing that he doesn't let us in on. But he never performed any miracles. The resurrection is particularly important for all of the deists. It just couldn't happen. Man's destiny. Jefferson believed that a man would survive death, that the righteous will see heaven, the wicked will suffer in hell. And he left those parts of the Bible in the teachings of Christ in his own abbreviated edition. So overall, Jefferson was a politician. He was a statesman. He was a natural philosopher. His theology was never the main point, but he definitely fits the deist framework. He was altogether heavily indebted, I believe, if unwittingly, to his Christian cultural background. Jefferson grew up in an Anglican background. They read from the Book of Common Prayer and from the Bible every week. Now, he didn't believe all of it, but it was there as a part of his cultural background. And so we see those elements coming through in Jefferson's work. Okay, I wanted to bring up at least one modern deist. Deism has fallen out of favor on the philosophical scene, but we still find them. A character by the name of Martin Gardner is an American mathematician and science author, just died recently in 2010. He called himself a philosophical theist, but he was a 20th century deist. He was like Paine and Jefferson and others. Most of the deists, Gardner says, were actually what I call theists. I would call myself a deist if the word were less misleading and had not dropped out of common use. So he wants to call himself a theist, but he's not really. He's because he doesn't believe in miracles. So let's look at what this modern deist actually teaches. First, God is a God who is in some way outside the universe, who in some manner created the universe, who has made some sort of a plan for humanity and for every person, a God to whom we can pray, which is interesting. Above all, a God who sustains our hope for immortality, our hope for immortality. A personal God, yes, the God of Christianity, but not only of Christianity, the God of Judaism, of Islam, and hundreds of smaller faiths, which he doesn't bother to list since they don't exist. But anyway, lots of minor ones. You don't have to be a Christian. Islam is every bit as good. The God of Plato and Kant and Charles Peirce and 1,000 other eminent philosophers and writers who were theists unshackled by the doctrines of any organized religious institution. So there you can see again the common thread in deism. We want to have a great big God, the God of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and infinite God who doesn't interfere and produce doctrine that we have to worry about. So, okay, that's him. God is wholly other, and yet he is somehow close. He is beyond understanding, yet he may be modeled for human thought. We can think about him. God is personal, Gardner says, because man needs a personal contact. Okay, why is God personal? Well, because we really want him to be. He's intelligent and powerful and good and loving and merciful and just, but in an infinite sort of way. Okay, there's only one God. Why is there only one God? According to Gardner, because man has an unavoidable longing to use a similar term here, a singular term. We want to talk about one God. It's kind of off-putting to talk about multiple gods and doesn't make very good sense either. Okay, so how does God exist? If we take seriously our hope, this is Gardner speaking, that justice will be done with respect to our lives, we must posit an afterlife. Okay, so we start with ourselves, and we've got this hope that good will be rewarded and evil will be punished. And so we have to think about a life after. And if there is an afterlife, there must be a God who is good enough and powerful enough to provide it. Okay, it's actually not much of an argument. I can't help but think that there must be a God, so there must be a God. All right. Unlike other deists before him, Gardner doesn't think God's existence can be logically proven or even scientifically demonstrated. He rejects the idea that God has revealed himself in any of the ways, scripture or miracle, the incarnation, that might provide some proof. But mankind needs the emotional support of having a God and a deep passion to find meaning. So what the head cannot decide, Gardner says, or if the head goes against what the heart desperately desires, one should go with one's heart. Take a leap of faith that to one's mind is irrational and absurd. What is there to lose? So belief in God is irrational. It is absurd, but what have you got to lose? That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. Again, we'll go back to Paley's watchmaker. Here's a watch that you found in the woods. Gardner believes that God created the universe, but seems to favor a creation out of pre-existing material. This is something that's been added. In the 18th century, the idea of evolution hadn't really arrived. But in the 20th century, evolution is everywhere. So Gardner was into a creation out of pre-existing material, just like the watchmaker uses the metal and the plastic and the gears and the paint and whatnot to make his watch. So God took a bunch of pre-existing material, eternal material, from which he made the world, just like a craftsman makes a watch and he upholds and guides it. Okay, Gardner holds that the universe actually does exist, which is nice of him, and that it would exist without mankind, which is different than some. The panentheists believe that it wouldn't. He believes that life evolved in a purely naturalistic way without any special input from God, besides the installation of natural laws. So there's nothing unique about man. Man simply evolved, and it all happens in purely naturalistic ways. How about miracles? Well, obviously Gardner rejects the idea of miracles. God doesn't break the laws. Never breaks the natural rhythm of nature to produce genuine miracles. To believe otherwise is mere superstition. On the other hand, he holds that everything is miraculous. Every blade of grass and newborn bird is a miracle. Okay, well, it seems like a contradiction of terms, but for Gardner, this makes sense. Gardner has no problem with prayer, as long as we're praising God or adoring the creation or something like that. But he rejects any kind of petition or intercession. So if I'm praying and I ask that my friend Paul, who is now traveling in Italy, can quickly get over the effects of his COVID and get on with his work, that's interceding. And I'm asking God to change his mind and operate inside the world in some special way, which is, Gardner says, impossible. Okay, so what happens to man? Gardner teaches that man arose through evolutionary means. God may have overseen the emergence, but doesn't break the chain. Man is a rational, emotional, personal being with an immaterial part. Gardner is not quite sure how to present this soul idea, but he is sure that something like a soul exists. Gardner wants to teach human free will, but he has a problem with this directing and sustaining God. If a decision is actually free, he argues, it must be undetermined. But how can decisions be made apart from a cause, in which case they are not free? Okay, this is a point that's been argued by philosophers and theologians for thousands of years. And somehow Gardner thinks that he's come up with some new problem. This is a problem that Christians have had all the way back to, if we can go all the way back to Job and see this problem coming up. Evil is every kind of pain and suffering, whatever the cause. Since deists believe that God is all good and all powerful, just like theists do, this is a problem. Atheists solve the problem by denying the existence of God, which is actually rational. Gardner considers several options. One, maybe we could go with the pantheistic ideas of reincarnation and karma. What goes around comes around. We get recycled, come back as birds or fish or monkeys or something. And ultimately, Gardner says this is unsatisfying. The Christian answer is that evil contributes in some way to God's plan for the best of all possible worlds. This was the view of the Christian philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, and is actually the best answer that we have. Gardner gives the answer that no answer is possible. There, suffering and pain happen. God is all good and all powerful, and we just can't solve the problem. Okay, ethics. There are standards in ethics, norms of right and wrong that apply everywhere, all the time, all the places, because they derive from the needs of a common human nature. That's an interesting move. And we see a lot of this in modern ethics courses, whatnot. The human nature demands that we have a taboo on, say, murder. Okay, you shall not kill, is not because life is sacred and God has given us life. It's because we as men prefer to live. And so we've got this human nature thing. So Gardner teaches a kind of classical view of natural law. The laws of the universe are set down in creation and include not only physical laws, but moral law as well. And these can be clearly seen in the common law in every human society. He says these haven't evolved. These are the common human natural needs. But like most deists, he holds that moral law is not relative, which is fascinating. This is one of the reasons that deism fails. Uh, he's right there. Moral law can't be relative. Ethics can't depend on the situation or the culture, but are fixed in the nature of the universe as given by God. There's no other way for it to be. Okay, so Gardner's idea of truth is fascinating. And again, he's going all the way back to Aristotle. Like ethical laws, truth is universal and it corresponds to reality. Truth is not relative. Gardner would say it's irrational to say that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Truth is universal. And when we make truth claims, they ought to be tested by their correspondence with reality. Aristotle would have understood that fully. Truth doesn't spring into existence, neither is it dependent on individuals or cultures or on what works. So Gardner is, he's preaching to the choir here in my church. I agree with him on that. The deists were not all wrong. So is there anything to be learned from history? Well, quite a lot. Human government is absolutely necessary. The best government combines democracy, which means that representatives are elected and people have an actual choice. Voting is fair. That would be a good thing. Extensive government regulation to make sure everyone has everything that they need is a really good thing. That's Gardner. He doesn't see the contradictions between those two positions. So he would be what in the modern world would be a social democrat. He believes that elected representatives and real votes, but the government needs to be big enough to provide for everybody. Gardner sees the goal of history as a gradual political improvement toward utopia. This will happen by sacrifice, cooperation, a belief in a God who we can't really be known, but whom we desire emotionally. Okay, ultimately, Gardner's view seems to me a bit wishy-washy, but he's a good representative of a lot of modern thinking in this direction. So basic beliefs. This is the fundamental stuff. This is what deism is about. And there's actually a lot here to like. First, God is one in nature and in person. All deists believe that God is one, eternal, unchangeable, all-knowing, all-powerful being. But it's important to recognize that they mean absolutely one, not a trinity, certainly not Jesus as Son of God. In the modern world, in America, we have a group we call Unitarians, and there are similar groups in Europe, and they've spread to other parts of the world. The Unitarians believe in essentially the deistic God, a monist God. So there is only the one. They deny the Trinity. They still want to be thought of as Christians, like Thomas Jefferson did, but they don't believe in Christ. You know. Secondly, the world is finite and operates on natural laws. Unlike God, the world had a beginning. God created it, as Gardner says, somehow. They don't really know. Natural law flows from the nature of God and is eternal. Okay, so that's an important idea. Thirdly, the world is God's sole revelation. There isn't anything else. Like a painting reveals a bit about the painter, and the watch speaks of the watchmaker, God reveals some of himself in the world that he makes. Fourthly, miracles do not occur. Either God cannot or will not intervene in the world, and natural law is inviolable. Therefore, a violation of natural law is impossible by definition. A very popular argument amongst non-Christians who are arguing that the Bible talks about miracles, but we all know miracles can't happen because the law of gravity. The fact that we call it a law doesn't mean that God isn't operating by a larger natural law. Anyway, so 5, man is endowed with reason and should live by reason. Reason and science are the primary guides to life. Okay, we should live by reason. The age of reason, here we are. We should not be living by unreasonable things like a miraculous God who has revealed the Bible to us. Sixthly, ethics are grounded in nature. Deists differ on the universality of natural law, but they agree that the basis is universal. It comes from God. They disagree on which specific natural laws are absolute and which are relative. And that keeps going on. If there is no special revelation to explain the meaning of general revelation, then it's actually a little difficult to understand. That's what the Bible is for, literally. Seventh, man's destiny includes an afterlife. Most of the deists hold to some kind of an afterlife. There are some possibilities that don't, but most of the deists who wrote and continue to write believe in some kind of an afterlife, and all dogs go to heaven kind of afterlife. Mostly this includes reward for good deeds and some kind of punishment for bad deeds. And then finally, history is linear. I shouldn't say linear, is linear and is purposeful. It's going someplace. It's not going in a circle. Deists don't like the idea of reincarnation. So God may exert providence in history. So God is moving things along in a good direction. The study of history can help us understand our mistakes and cure them and so on. So an evaluation, there's several good contributions. Many have agreed with the deists' insistence on the importance of reason in religious matters. It makes very little sense to trust something that is not demonstrably trustworthy. I've often said this. Everybody who makes a religious claim shouldn't be taken at face value necessarily. Skepticism is always good. Yeah, if I walk in and say, I am the reincarnation of Krishna, you must listen to all I have to say. You actually have an obligation to be skeptical. What if I'm not really the reincarnation of Krishna? What is the basis of my claim? Do I have any evidence to support my claim? What are you going to say? How are you going to make this argument? I tend in the real world, it makes sense to be skeptical of things until you've tested them. So I made a mistake several weeks ago when I was putting an engine in my daughter's car. I believed that the people who sold it to me had checked it. As it happened, they hadn't checked it, and there were a lot of things wrong with it. And I didn't find out about that until I had installed the engine and started it up the first time. It had a blown head gasket and some other bad things. And so I ended up having to take the engine apart and rebuild the parts that needed rebuilding. It was a big pain in the neck. I should have checked. I shouldn't trust anything that is not demonstrably trustworthy. So the deists are right about that. Secondly, the deists have been commended for their belief that the world reflects the existence of God. This is either a cosmological or a teleological argument, and it is, in fact, valid. Uh, it's not going to convince a non-Christian, but it's a valid argument. There's nothing wrong with those arguments. And then finally, the deists many have credited the deists for their exposure of religious deception and superstition. The high-flying evangelists with their Learjets and their gold chains should be exposed for the charlatans they are. And superstition is a bad thing. If I believe that turning around 3 times and making the sign of the cross is going to somehow make my trip into town safer, that's stupid. And the deists were, in fact, right. I'm going to add that the deistic emphasis on natural law is actually biblically sound. The deists don't believe that they have biblical support for their view, but in fact, they do. God created a universe with natural law, and some of those natural laws are spiritual and moral. Those things are true. The relationship of marriage is sacred to God, the family, the children. This is very important to God. And he put, there are 3 commandments in the 10 commandments that directly have to do with the family. This is very important to God. And it's also obvious from natural law. If all we're studying is nature itself, we're going to discover that it's really best for one man and one woman to make a lifetime commitment to one another, for them to raise children together, and for those children to obey their parents when they're little and honor their parents as they get older. For a man not to commit adultery or even to covet his neighbor's wife. All of these things make perfectly good sense from a purely natural law perspective. But when we see them grounded in the character of God himself and expanded on in biblical law, we've got the whole package. So Deism got a lot right, but they missed the importance of the Bible. So I'm going to critique deism rather quickly. First, the deistic understanding of God is incompatible with their rejection of miracles. If they think that God is all powerful and all knowing and infinite in every way, he could easily do miracles. There's no reason to reject miracles. Secondly, some have criticized the deistic notion of natural law. In the modern world, there are lots of people who believe that natural law needs to be rejected in favor of a purely relativistic law. I don't share that criticism, but there are a lot of deism came under a lot of attack there. Thirdly, deists cased against reports of miracles, displays, and naturalistic bias, which assumes the very view that deist needs to prove. They say, and what this means is they're begging the issue. They say miracles are impossible, and so when you read a report of a miracle, that has to be wrong because miracles are impossible. Well, the point they need to prove is that miracles are impossible. If God is all powerful, he can do miracles if he chooses. So miracles are obviously not impossible if we grant the deist the God that they are working with. Okay, fourthly, surely an all good creator would not abandon his creatures if he could help them. This is very important. The deists say that God is all good and yet he abandons his creation. Well, why would he do a thing like that? And they try to hedge that bet, but it doesn't really work. Fifthly, the deist attack on the supernatural revelation, broadly attacked, if miracles are possible, then we really can't reject the Bible out of hand without examining the specific evidence of the claims. And so in modern scholarship, the support for the inerrancy of Scripture, the support for the text of the Bible, the support for the on the ground evidential support for biblical history has hammered away at the foundation of deism, and it just hasn't worked out well for the deists. And sixthly, the deist case against Christianity in the Bible has been examined by many and found wanting. Modern scholarly research into languages and archaeology, historical correlations, has more than demonstrated the reliability of the biblical text and its claims to inspiration. So, what happened to deism? It died out early in the 19th century for the most part because of the careful attacks of Christian scholars. It's no longer a widely popular worldview, but elements of deism live on, not only in the Unitarian denomination, but also in groups who want to call themselves Christian, but who wish to deny biblical authority. That's very widespread, and we find it worldwide. And then thirdly, deism was always the position of people who want some of the culture and political advantages of religion without the discipline of reading and understanding the Bible. They want to be able to ignore the Bible and yet still be thought of as good Christian people. I can't give them that. These are non-Christians who had some true ideas, but they don't deserve our respect for their Christianity. Okay, that's, let me see if I can make this go away. Yes, I can. I can stop the share. All right. Here we are. Folks, you're so patient. I went long today. It'll be a few weeks before we get back together again. We're going to take off now from now until the first Wednesday in September. So all of the month of August. Those of you in Italy already know that many of you are called away to other places of work during the month of August and during the time of vacation, and I get it. You'll be in our prayers, and I will see you again with another Bible study on the first Wednesday in September. So God bless everybody. We love you all. Donna would say hi. Deborah is off at the park now. Thanks, guys. Love you all.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. I know.
Bye-bye.
I know. It gets to be a long evening. Ciao, ciao.